Good day to you. Hope you're having a wonderful day. We're reading in the book of Joshua. Now, I know it's been a while. We're back and forth kind of on different subjects, but I'm going to continue on in the book of Joshua. Last time we read Joshua chapter 9, and in Joshua chapter 9, we had the Gibeonites who deceived Joshua and the elders of Israel, and they managed to stay with them and still live in the land. So now we're ready to read Joshua chapter 10, where 5 kings attack Gibeon. I am reading in the Amplified Bible. When Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the residents of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were living among them, he and his people feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. So Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon with a combined army, because it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons, people of Israel." Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and they camped by Gibeon and fought against it. Now you might remember in chapter 9, originally the Gibeonites had made a pact with these other kings that they were going to fight against Israel. But then they turned around. It's like they changed their mind, and it didn't talk about that. The text didn't talk about that literally, but it shows that they changed their mind and they actually deceived Joshua and the elders so that they could live at peace there in the land with them. Now here, these kings that they had made a deal with previously are now turning on them. And you could say rightly so or not, doesn't really matter. The fact is they fear them because Gibeon was obviously, as it says, because they were a great city. Gibeon was mighty. All its men were mighty. So they're afraid that with this extra manpower, Israel is going to be able to defeat them more easily, right? So that's the problem here. Right, just to show you, if we back up to chapter 9 for a second, and we look at, let's look at verses, let's look at the first few verses. When all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland at the western edge of the hills of Judea, and all along the coast of the great Mediterranean Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now the Hivite is the Gibeonites. That's just a different name for them. Heard of this army and its victories over Jericho and Ai, they gathered together with one purpose, to fight with Joshua and with Israel. Now in verse 3 it says, "But when the people of Gibeon, the Hivites, heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they too acted craftily and cunningly and set out and took along provisions." This is where they deceived Joshua and the elders of Israel. So actually, the text plainly says that when they heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they changed their minds. So that is the turning point right there. That's when Gibeon changed and decided to basically deceive Israel and be able to live among them. So, but in doing that, they betrayed these other kings, these other people, which is what I was getting at. And I wrongly said the text did not say why, but actually the text does say exactly why. They heard of the defeat at Jericho and Ai, of those 2 great cities. each of these great cities were almost like a little kingdom to themselves. So when those were defeated, the Gibeonites or the Hivites, they go by both names, they were afraid. And so they're like, we've got to find a way to make peace with these people. We don't want to leave, and we don't want to fight them because we'll be destroyed, right? So actually, the text does say, that was my error. I apologize. We're just people. Sometimes we make mistakes. But I want to continue on from here, because these kings that they had previously had this agreement with, now they're coming against Gibeon. So the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us, for all 5 of the kings of the Amorites who live in the hill country have assembled against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the men of valor. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, because I have given them into your hand. Not one of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came upon them suddenly, surprising them by marching uphill all night from Gilgal. And the Lord caused them to panic and be confused before Israel. And he struck them dead in a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goes up to Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones of hail from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. More Amorites died because of the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So first, I want to apologize. I'm horrible reading these names. I apologize. I try to do better, but I struggle with some of those names and just have to admit that. But I think it's a very strong point here that the Lord threw down large stones of hail on these enemies and killed more of them than the army of Israel actually did. So I think that's very interesting. See, the Lord, when the Lord was with them, he fought for them, and he would do the bulk of the work for them, right? It's something we've read about previously, and we'll continue to see that, at least here in Joshua. Things are kind of going to change when we get into Judges, but you'll always see, even up through Kings and Chronicles, that when the Lord is with them, they are victorious. But the problem is not with the Lord, it's with the children of Israel. When they will stay with the Lord, and see, maybe I said that wrong. Just like with us, the Lord is always on our side. The question is, are we on his side? And that's why Israel is such a good example for us. They're just people just like us. And so many times they stray from God. They wander off to do what they want to do, right? And they want to worship these other gods and do these other things. They get into trouble. And so when they're not on God's side, when they're straying off and doing other things, they get into trouble. But when they're on God's side, when they're following the Lord, then he's doing all these great and wonderful things for them. So it's just something we really need to point out, because that still applies to us today. When we are on the Lord's side, everything is better. It's not that you won't have troubles. It's not that this life won't still be kind of crazy sometimes. But when you're on the Lord's side, you have that peace, that strength of will. There's all these good things that come with being on the Lord's side, with following him, studying the word. All those things strengthen you in this life. So let's continue on. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord handed over the Amorites to the sons of Israel. And Joshua said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation of Israel took vengeance upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Joshua, so the sun stood still in the middle of the sky and was in no hurry to go down for about a whole day? There has not been a day like that before it or after it, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord was fighting for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. So this is a miracle here. It's not a miracle that Joshua performed. I want you to understand, Joshua spoke to the Lord on the day when the Lord handed over the Amorites, right? So Joshua spoke to the Lord and then said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still, right? So this was something he had spoke with the Lord already about. Now you could say maybe he was saying to the Lord, have the sun stand still. That's acceptable as well. But to me, it sounds like Joshua spoke to the Lord and then he did this in the sight of the people of Israel. So that the Lord had told him, do this. I'm going to have the sun stand still. And this is what we're going to do. And then that's what happened. Now, I know that's another one of those miracles that we can't absolutely prove, but it is a miracle that happened, and I believe the Word of God. I believe the account here. This nation of people saw this, and they recorded this. So it is their eyewitness account that this happened. Now these 5 Amorite kings fled and hid themselves in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua was told, the 5 kings have been found and are hidden in the cave at Makkedah. Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and assign men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them from the rear. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand. Now when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking the Amorites dead in a very great defeat, until they were wiped out, and the surviving remnant among them had entered the fortified cities, all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a threatening word against any of the sons of Israel. Now notice that some people did escape back into their cities. So there was a surviving remnant that had entered their fortified cities. They had managed to flee back. Now, so then everyone returned here to this camp at Makkedah, where that cave is, where those kings are. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring out to me those 5 Amorite kings from the cave. They did so and brought these 5 Amorite kings out of the cave to him, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. When they brought these kings out to Joshua, Joshua called for all the men of Israel and told the commanders of the men of war who had gone with him, come up close, put your feet on the necks of these kings. So they came forward and put their feet on the necks of the 5 kings. Joshua said to them, do not fear or be dismayed, intimidated. Be strong and courageous, for this is what the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you are about to fight. Then afterward Joshua struck them with his sword and put them to death, and he hung them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. At sunset, Joshua gave a command, and they took the bodies down from the trees and threw them into the cave where the kings had hidden themselves, and placed large stones over the mouth of the cave, where they remain to this day. What Joshua is teaching his commanders there is that these are just men. The Lord will give their enemies to them, and these are just men. Do not be afraid. Do not fear these men. A lot of times, we're kind of taught to be in awe of rulers, kings and queens and presidents and congressmen. We're taught to be in all of these people, we're taught to look up to them and to think they are above us and better than us, but they're not. And if they come against the Lord will bring them down. And this is what's happened here. The Lord has brought these kings down, and Joshua is just showing his men that these kings are just men. No one to be afraid of. Have courage. Do not be intimidated by these men. So that was the lesson he was giving his commanders. And if you think about that, you can apply that to our daily lives. We do not need to be intimidated by situations, by bad things that happen. We don't need to be intimidated by our government and by people in power over us. Yes, we should be peaceful and serve properly, but we do not need to be intimidated or pushed in wrong ways to do things that are incorrect, right? So it's one thing to follow the law and live a nice, peaceable life like we should, a peaceful life, but it's different when we let people intimidate us and push us into doing wrong things, and we don't want that. So what we want to do is we want to understand that these situations will happen, but the Lord is greater than those situations. God is greater than our circumstances. God is much greater than any circumstance we may find ourselves in. He can always bring us through those things. We just need to trust in Him. And so, in a way, that is a good lesson for us as well. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it and everyone who was in it. He left no survivor. So he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went on from Makkedah to Libnah and fought against Libnah. The Lord gave it also along with its king into the hands of Israel, and Joshua struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. So he did to the king of Libnah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all Israel with him moved on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. The Lord gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and Joshua captured it on the second day, and struck it, and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, just as he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, went up to help Lachish, and Joshua struck him and his people down until he had left him no survivor. And Joshua and all Israel with him went on from Lachish to Eglon, and they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword. And on that day he utterly destroyed every person who was in it, just as he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it, and captured it, and struck it and its king and all its cities, and all the persons who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor, just as he had done to Eglon. He utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debir, and fought against it, and he captured it with its king and all its cities, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. They left no survivor. Just as he had done to Hebron, so Joshua did to Debir and its king, as he had done also to Libnah and its king. So Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, the Negev, south country, and the lowland and the slopes that descend to the Dead Sea, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. So this is an account of a lot of capturing that went on. Of course, these 5 kings really brought this to a head by coming to attack the Gibeonites, who they were obviously offended by. That makes sense from a human standpoint of what was going on. But then that created this situation where then Joshua went and defeated each of those. He had already defeated their armies and their kings. So then he went and defeated each of those city kingdoms, which that's kind of when we're talking about these cities and their fortified cities, they're kind of, each one is kind of like its own little kingdom. That's the idea here. So just, they're not huge. You may think of them as being really big. They're good size for their time, but I don't think they're really huge like we think of. When we think of a city today, if you think of like Chicago, LA, or New York, or, just big cities like that, these were not big like in that sense, okay? So just something to keep in mind as we read through this. Historically, these city kingdoms, they were good size for their time, but they weren't that big. I should probably do some research and see what the normal size of these towns would have been. I'm sure it would have been a few thousand people, maybe upwards, maybe more than that. Maybe a big one would be 10,000 people. Hard to be sure just from reading the accounts. We have to remember the children of Israel, though, just their fighting force was I think it was around 100,000 people or more. So they really had quite a big army, though they didn't always use all of them. And we'll see that as time goes on too. But they were at least 1 million strong when they were coming out of Egypt. So assuming that they maintained at least that much of their population, then at 1 million strong, I would expect at least a force of 100,000, probably more good fighting men. So just a thought, something to keep in mind. So these cities were probably somewhat smaller than that anyway, but then they had the Lord on their side. So no matter what these kings were doing, even when they combined themselves together and came against Israel and the Gibeonites, they really did not stand a chance, especially with the Lord raining down these hailstones. So I just want to mention in closing of this chapter, when you're on God's side, when you're with God and God is with you, you can accomplish a lot. You can do a lot. You can really be successful in your life. Now, success is not always about money and material things and property, but it is about living a good life for the Lord. It's about bringing people to the Lord, helping the needy, doing all these things that we see Jesus doing and his disciples doing afterwards, and all these things that he told us that we should be doing. So that's Joshua chapter 10. I want to thank you for listening. Hope you have a wonderful day. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe. And remember, God loves you.